Greetings from NAFSA 2018. This is NAFSA Worldview with Emma Skye. I'm Diana Carlin. I'm a member of the NAFSA Board of Directors and Professor Emerita of Communication and former Senior International Officer at St. Louis University. Emma Skye is the Director of the Maurice R. Greenberg World Fellows Program and a Senior Fellow at the university's Jackson Institute, where she teaches Middle East politics. She's the author of The Unraveling High Hopes and Missed Opportunities in Iraq. She served as an advisor to the Commanding General of the U.S. Forces in Iraq from 2007 to 2010, as an advisor to the commander of NATO's International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan in 2006. Prior to that, she worked in the Palestinian territories for a decade, managing projects to develop Palestinian institutions and to promote coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians. In addition, she's provided technical assistance on poverty elimination, human rights, justice, public administration reform, security sector reform, and conflict resolution in the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. It's a pleasure to have you here with us and to speak with you today, Emma. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Emma, here at our annual conference, you're a special guest speaker, and your topic is Unraveling the Middle East. For our audience, and especially for our international educators, what should they specifically be aware of that's happening in the Middle East right now that could affect their work as international educators?
A lot of the news that we hear from the Middle East is always negative. It's always about violence, it's always about wars, refugees. But I think people need to bear in mind that the Middle East is full of an increasingly young population, young people who've got the same hopes and aspirations of young people in other countries. The difference that they face is they're living in weak states and they have limited opportunities, where we are much more fortunate to live in stronger, more capable states that give young people opportunities. But they have the same hopes and aspirations as young people everywhere.
One of those hopes and aspirations were really seen in the Arab Spring. And people were really hoping for dramatic and positive change, but it hasn't necessarily happened. Why do you think it didn't happen?
When you think back to 2011, those images of all those young people coming out in the streets, demanding an end to corruption, demanding better governance, demanding to be treated with dignity, I think there was great hopes that the regimes would reform. But that, as you said, it hasn't happened. The regimes have either collapsed or countered. And where they've collapsed, civil war has been the result. We've seen civil war in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya. Often, opposition groups were able to come together to oppose what was happening, to oppose the regime, but they failed to bring about a vision for a better future, let alone implement that vision. And so it seems to be those groups that were the most ruthless came out on top. Revolutions tend to devour their children. We've seen that elsewhere. But this is not the end. This is just one stage, one phase. Because unless regimes do reform, unless they do provide more jobs for the young people, treat young people with more dignity and respect, young people will rise up again. So it will just keep going.
We have many Middle Eastern students on our campuses who our members are working with, and given what you've said in these first two responses, how should they take that into consideration as they work with those students?
I think, you treat students, no matter where they're from, in the same manner. But it's giving an understanding of they come from very difficult contexts. And the challenges facing the Arab states are very complex. There's a whole legitimacy crisis in these states. So you can, this problem dates back to when they were set up, the end of colonialism, after World War I, with the establishment of the modern Middle Eastern states. So there's this crisis of legitimacy. Often these states, the newly independent states, were taken over by men who were militaristic, they were often from minorities, and they ruled through oppression. They became very authoritarian states. And so the state building was incomplete. And the challenge now in the information era, when everyone has access to so much information, it's becoming harder and harder to govern. But the real challenge is how to reform the state. It's the state that's the root cause of the problem. When you look at terrorist groups, they are symptoms rather than the root cause of what ails the Middle East.
The Iraq War officially ended December 18th of 2011, but the impact in the whole region continues to today. Where is Iraq today in terms of being a viable, vital, and stable nation?
Well, the Iraq War, that date, that's kind of the date, that's our date. It's not necessarily their date. Since 2003, maybe 1 million Iraqis have died in the war, in the civil war. And millions have been displaced from their homes. So it's a country, we tend to think of Iraq as starting in 2003. Its history obviously didn't start in 2003. It's a country that has had war after war after war. It's been through the Iran-Iraq war, it's been through the war with Kuwait, it's been through sanctions, and then after 2003, the invasion. And yet, despite all of this, there is an incredible resiliency among the Iraqi people. So you can see students in Mosul are getting their schools operating, they've got the library back open. They actually have optimism towards their future. I think they feel it can't, they've seen the worst that it can be, so it can only get better. So Iraq has a long way still to go. They just held elections. There is concern that the new government will be the same as the old government. You see young people protesting all the time about the lack of electricity, the levels of corruption. So it has a long way to go, but never underestimate Iraqis.
The Islamic State, or ISIS, was once a serious threat to stability in the region, and now appears that their influence may be waning. Is ISIS truly on the way to being defeated, or is there more to be done?
ISIS holds very little territory now. It's really been pushed back in Iraq and inside Syria. And so that caliphate, if you like, the physical caliphate, is losing more and more territory and will lose all the territory it's held in those two countries. But the circumstances that gave rise to ISIS, the grievances that led to the rise of ISIS, have not been dealt with. And unless they are dealt with, then a few years down the road, there could be another iteration of ISIS as a rejection of the ruling authorities, as an attempt to create something that is not linked back to colonialism, something that's meant to be authentic, which of course it is not. But if the injustices and grievances aren't dealt with, they will find traction among a very small percent of Muslims around the world, but they will find it.
How should one approach those injustices and grievances to prevent ISIS from getting a foothold again?
It goes back to governments being better governments, so treating all citizens of their country as equal citizens before the law, giving them opportunities and work opportunities. The situation has to be pretty bad for people to think of as ISIS as a better alternative. But when you ask young people around the region what sort of world they want to live in, it looks like Dubai, not like Daesh. They want to have, they want to live lives. They want to educate their children. They want to have jobs. They want to have good health care. They want the same things as we want.
President Donald Trump recently withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal. The reasons, according to the president, include that Iran continues to test missiles and also supports Bashar al-Assad in Syria. What do you see as the short-term and potential long-term impacts due to this shift in U.S. policy?
It's a tricky question, Iran and its role in the region. The Iraq War and the way in which we left Iraq as a weak state has accelerated the geopolitical competition between Iran on the one side and Saudi on the other. And this leads them to support sectarian actors in different countries across the region, turning what are grievances, local grievances, into these regional proxy wars. Now, President Obama was focused on defeating ISIS and on preventing nuclear proliferation in the region. He really wanted to pivot away from the Middle East towards Asia. And so the nuclear deal with Iran was just about the nuclear weapons. It didn't, under Obama, there was no pushback on Iran's nefarious activities across the region. And this has been of concern to our allies in the region who think the US was either blind to what was happening or realigning with Iran against them. So it has created lots of other problems in the region. So I think President Trump is, in a way, he is trying to create a better balance in the region by trying to put Iran on notice to say, stop doing these nefarious activities. The problem being that the list of demands made of Iran are more than Iran can ever do. So it looks like once again we are pushing for regime change in Iran. And yes, the regime in Iran is a very problematic regime. But I think our learning from the last decade, 15 years, is be careful what you wish for. Because the removal of one regime doesn't necessarily lead to liberal democracy as its replacement.
You mentioned this competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the region. Can you expand on that a little more?
Both countries in a way see themselves as regional leaders of the Muslim world, big players. And when you go back to the 70s, the US policy was like these twin pillars, Iran and Saudi. Those would be the twin pillars that maintained a balance of power, regional hegemony. After 1979, with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, that changed because that regime and the US are very hostile towards each other. Now, the 2003 war basically removed the state of Iraq as a buffer. Iraq had been the strong Arab state pushing back on Iran. And when we collapsed the Iraqi state in 2003, it meant that Iran was able to project power and expand because of the weakness of the Arab countries. And to mobilize people in the region, both Iran and Saudi instrumentalized religion. So the war is not a war of Sunni versus Shia. It's not a religious war. It's a war in which these outside or these regional powers instrumentalize religion to gain support for themselves against each other. So they don't fight each other directly. They fight through proxies.
NAFSA 2018, as you know, is a global conference of international educators from over 100 countries. And what role do you believe international education plays in addressing and finding potential solutions to these issues that you've been discussing with us?
I think education is key. When you look across the Middle East, how many young people have been displaced from their homes? And if they don't have access to education, they're not going to learn skills that will make them marketable in the job market. And so I think international educators around the world can look at ways in which they can provide distance learning, accreditation. We've got all, internet capabilities, modern technologies to mean that we can provide educational opportunities to people wherever they are. And I think there's a lot that the international community and international educators can do to give those young people in the Middle East, no matter how difficult their circumstances, an opportunity for education.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience that you think would be helpful for them in either understanding the Middle East situation or working with their students?
Just to look at a hopeful, optimistic future. It's possible. Too often when people look at the Middle East, they just have a very negative view of it. And I think it's really important for young people to have a horizon of hope, things to live for, things to, dedicate their energies to. And all of us, wherever we are in the world, if we're educators, I think we have a duty to help young people envisage an optimistic future, a horizon of hope.
Thank you for leaving us on an optimistic note, and thank you for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you.